Hey everyone, if you're a regular listener of the show, I hope you'll consider joining my Patreon community. It's a great way to support the show and get extra exclusive episodes, including Digging for Justice, my DC movie rewatch podcast. Bonus episodes are available beginning at the $1 level, you can cancel anytime, and discounted annual memberships are available too. Visit patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all patrons. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman Smashes the Klan and its 1946 radio show inspiration, Klan of the Fiery Cross, is the host of the Truth, Justice, and Hope podcast, first-time guest on this show, Grant Richter. Welcome.
Truth and Justice, Anthony. Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure.
Delighted to be here.
I was just telling you off mic, I just listened to the episode of the Krypton Report podcast that you did with our mutual friend, Tyler Patrick. Now, my audience knows Tyler was just on this show a week ago. We talked about the Kirk Alyn movie serials. Mm-hmm. And now in this episode, like I said, we'll be talking about this 1946 radio story that was the basis for the recent Superman Smashes the Klan comic book in 2019. So over these couple of episodes, we're definitely looking back at some of the earliest adaptations of the character, and also, for me, and I suspect a lot of others, filling in some gaps, because I feel like when we talked about this last time with the movie serials and with the radio show, I feel like, not to speak for all Superman fans, but I feel like if we have some gaps, these are probably a couple of them. So it's been fascinating to dive in.
It is. It's been, I've gotten addicted to the show. I've gone back and started listening to earlier story arcs, and it is fascinating. And it's actually inspired me to start reading the Golden Age, because I've had very little interest in pre-crisis before now, but I'm really filling in all my gaps because of listening to the radio show.
That's fantastic. Well, I had an interesting experience preparing for this episode, because when I originally conceived of this episode, and even when I reached out to you, in my mind, we're covering the comic Superman Smashes the Klan by Gene Yang and the art team known as Gurihiru. And we were going to listen to the radio show and talk about it a little bit just for some added context. Mm-hmm. That was my intention. As I went through the process, though, and I don't say this to diminish the comic at all. The comic is very effective. It's wonderful. But I was so taken by that radio show storyline. I was blown away by what they did and how they did it at that time. It was so much more than what I would have expected from the radio show. And again, I have such little familiarity with it that I was really going in so cold, and I was just blown away. So much so that, when I think about this story, and yes, there are changes between the radio show and the comic, but at the heart of it, we have this young boy, Tommy Lee, this Chinese pitcher on a baseball team, who he and his family are targeted by the Klan of the Fiery Cross, the stand-in for the KKK in the 1940s. And in my mind now, when I think about the story, it's really the radio show that I'm gravitating towards so much. Yeah. So it was eye-opening. It's, ironic since it's a radio show.
Yeah. I was really surprised, because I'd read about the first issue of Smashes the Klan before, and I kind of moved on. I was like, well, I'll come back to it later. And like you said, it's like the radio show is the main thing, and then Smashes the Klan kind of takes it and then reproduces and adds things onto it. But it really is just building on everything from this radio show, and fantastic. And I'm so pleasantly surprised by exactly how progressive this radio show from the 1940s was. It's warmed my heart.
Yeah, it was, and not to belabor the point, but I was surprised by how far they went. Mm-hmm. When we get to the point in the radio serial where the Fiery Cross members set out to abduct and tar and feather young Tommy Lee, it was really, I was really taken aback. I was like, whoa, like this really packs a punch. I don't mean to make light of this, but I will say it was jarring at times to go from the often heavy material in the radio show to these Kellogg's Pep ads. So the
PEP, Pep, eat every drop. Your pal, Dan McCullough.
Yeah, don't waste it. Eat all your Pep. Yep. Don't waste it. So, Kellogg's is a sponsor of the radio show, and we had the ads for Kellogg's Pep at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. And of course, I had to look up Kellogg's Pep because while I know Kellogg's, of course, I was unfamiliar with that specific.
Yeah, me too. It's like Wheaties, basically.
Yeah, so they're these wheat flakes fortified with vitamin B and D. And I guess very popular in this time period, eventually discontinued in the 70s.
70s, yeah.
I believe. But so there were those moments, though, where the show was getting pretty heavy, and then we would jump immediately to these very peppy, pun intended, yes. Radio ads. But it was, listening to the ads, you really got the feel for what the experience was like listening to these back in the day. Now, let's talk about this radio show just generally first. So it ran from 1940 to 1951, over 2,000 episodes, astounding. And, I think a lot of Superman fans, even if you're not familiar with the show, we know that it gave us Perry White and Jimmy Olsen and Kryptonite and the Daily Planet. Like a lot came from the radio show and certainly was an inspiration, for a lot of the Fleischer stuff and the Kirk Alyn movie serials and the George Reeves show. I mean, it really set the tone and the template, I think, for a lot of the stories in those early decades when it comes to Superman adaptations and other media.
Right. Yeah, it's astounding. Like I remember vaguely watching the George Reeves show with my grandfather when I was a little kid, and I've watched some Fleischer episodes, and like you said, it's amazing how much built on this radio show, and there's almost overlapping continuity between the radio show and the movie serials, like with the Atom Man, and then a character in the radio show called the Crimson Widow who became Spider Lady in the movie serials, all of which Gene Yang has included in some of his adaptations, which is really, I love Gene Yang. He's one of my favorite writers by now. Between this, his Batman Superman run from last year, I think, and then the new thing he's doing with Monkey Prince, he is just a phenomenal writer.
Yeah, I'm a bit newer to his work, but quickly becoming a fan, and I loved what he did with Smashes the Klan, and yeah, like you said, I mean, he utilizes Atom Man in Smashes the Klan and Spider Lady in that Batman Superman arc, which is really cool you don't often see pulls from, from the radio show and from that era, so it was really neat. But, until now, like I said, I had very little familiarity with the actual radio show. When I covered the various tellings of Superman's origin on this podcast about a year ago, I did listen to the first few radio shows, which was the first version of the origin. They would later redo it and bring it closer to the comics. But, we talked about it in the context of the origin story. And in that version, I've talked about this a bunch on the show, but, Superman arrives on Earth as an adult, comes out of the rocket ship, and, he saves a little kid and his grandfather, and the kid's like, oh, you should become a reporter and call yourself Clark Kent. And it was just,
you should call yourself Clark Kent. That's a pretty good name.
Yeah, it was pretty goofy. But on the positive side, the thing that I responded to then, and I'll echo it now because I just kept thinking of this as I was listening, there's something magical about listening to the radio show because it, on the one hand, it definitely transports you back to another time.
Yes.
Yet, there's something so timeless about it because it's radio. You watch the Kirk Alyn movie serials like Tyler and I did last week. And look, they're a product of their time. There are certain limitations. And, there's still something cool about watching it. I still got something out of it. But with the radio show, when you're just listening and you're using your imagination, it's like, if those were made today, the audio quality would be crisper and I'm sure there would be more effects and things like that. But basic heart and substance of it would be the same. And so there is something so timeless about it. So it was really cool just to kind of get into that form of storytelling, which for me is largely new.
And I think it's neat that things are starting to come back around that way too. I mean, you and I are obviously, familiar with the podcasting industry, but what first got me into podcasts was audio dramas. I started out with Welcome to Night Vale. And, I have a huge catalog of audio dramas that I listen to now. And I would honestly rather listen to audio drama podcasts than I would watch TV by now. And so it's neat kind of getting into that place where like our grandfathers were in the 1940s, well, maybe mine, because I'm a little bit older than you, but I even had a conversation with my grandfather who's in his 90s and is still alive. I'm like, hey, did you ever listen to the Superman radio show? He's like, yeah. So we had a neat, like 20-minute conversation about that a couple weeks ago. So it was neat being able to kind of reconnect with an older generation like that.
Oh, did he remember specific episodes or stories or anything?
No, I mean, he was like 12 when the show was on in 1940. And so he remembered more listening to things like The Shadow and stuff like that, which I've also listened to because I love pulp drama. Like I love The Shadow and The Spider and Doc Savage and things like that. So I can also relate on that level, which is another thing I really liked about this was how pulp-like the narration was in this series. And I have specific notes that I'll get to when we get to it, but.
Awesome. No, yeah, it was quite an experience, and we were talking off mic, but yeah, I know you've continued listening to others. I'm sure I will as well, and I suspect we'll do more coverage on it in the future because it's really this. Again, I always go back to this idea of gaps in my Superman fandom, and as I make my way through this podcast series, those gaps are getting closed. There aren't as many left now. As we're 70 episodes in here, and I've got a lot more mapped out, and I know where we're going, but. This still remains, especially with as many episodes as they did. Mm-hmm. There's still a lot to explore. As far as how we listened, and in case anyone, if anyone has listened to any of the radio show, it's very likely it was Clan of the Fiery Cross, definitely very well known. But I suspect there are a lot of people listening to this episode who have not checked out the show. So I did find there was a site I had sent you a link to that had at least some of them, but you directed me to something even better, the Old Time Superman radio show podcast, correct? Is that what it's called?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's another one by a podcast called Forble, Fourable. And they have the same thing, just with less commercials, with less modern ads in it too. But it has like you said, like 1,000, 2,000 episodes, something like that.
Gotcha. So if anyone's curious, again, you can find these online, and there are some podcasts out there, like the ones we mentioned, that are playing the episodes. And like you said, some have the modern commercials or a little bit of commentary at the beginning and the end, but primarily they're sharing these episodes. To my knowledge, there's no, Warner Brothers doesn't sell like a set of the radio episodes. I would happily buy if something like that were available. But.
Absolutely. Yeah. If I could purchase that, I'd be extremely happy.
So tell me a bit before we, dive in more fully to Fiery Cross and Smashes the Klan. Mm-hmm. I want to hear more about your Superman fan journey. And I mean, I have a sense of this from interacting with you on Twitter and your show and the episode of Krypton Report that you just did. But I think the thing that I'm so struck by that I would love to hear you talk about is how recently, I know you had been exposed to Superman when you were younger through Super Friends and the movie, but how recently you really dived into all of this.
Yeah, I fell in love with Superman as a character in December of 2020. I'd been a Marvel guy most of my life, and I was on the Marvel app, and I just got burned out on it, and I signed up from the DC app on a whim, and I spent a couple months just trying everything out. I tried some Green Arrow and some Green Lantern, some Kyle Rayner, stuff like that, and then I decided to try all of Rebirth, and the Rebirth Superman title in Action Comics just grabbed me the hardest. And once I got to, I think, issue 7 of Superman, the one where they go to the county fair, I was locked in. That's like, I am a Superman fan. And I started going back with Byrne's Man of Steel, and I have I've gone from Byrne's Man of Steel up to World of New Krypton so far since then. And still feeling out the New 52 a little bit here and there. But beyond that, I've got the rest of my gaps filled in from Rebirth to current as well. And I just jumped in feet first.
It's amazing. But, I think one of the things that's so cool about that is, and this is something that I always remind myself of, is like everyone comes to Superman. Well, not everyone comes to Superman, but those who do. And even if you're just talking comics generally or Superman specifically, like everyone has their own entry point, and it really doesn't matter like what the story is or where you are in your life. If it grabs you, you're in. Because I guess I always think about it in terms of, starting with the death of Superman. And for such a long time, I thought to myself, like, oh, I'm such a recent, like I got into this so recently. And, people have been reading since the Silver Age. And, now it dawns on me as we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of Death of Superman. It's like, you're kind of a veteran of this now, buddy. So, and it's great that you had the ability to immerse yourself so fully in all of this.
If it wasn't for the streaming services, I probably wouldn't be as into it as I am. Just the fact that I can take this massive library and just my ADHD brain wants to read everything at once. So I read as much as I can, as often as I can. And I work from home, so I have the time to do that, which is really nice. So, I just immersed myself in it completely.
Look, I know I knock the DC app often enough. There are some omissions that I feel should be corrected. However, there is a lot on there, and I would imagine, for me, it's sometimes frustrating because I'm looking for something so specifically, and but if you're just starting, there is a lot there. In fairness, so I'm glad.
I think once you hit Infinite Crisis, the gaps close, and there aren't as many. But everything from before then, it is pretty, unfortunately, gappy, especially around the blue energy area. That was rough.
We'll eventually
all the significant parts of the blue energy area are missing. I'm like, okay, I don't know. I'll just wing it, I guess.
Yeah, not to take us too far afield, but I have explored that a bit, mapping out the future, because we'll get there eventually on the show. And they're missing the Superman Red, Superman Blue one shot that splits the Electric Superman into two, and they're missing Superman Forever, the one shot that returns him to his traditional powers and costume. It's like, guys. Come on. I guess I guess the priority is, the ongoing series, but it's like these one shots are really critical. If I could ever, I really would love to do an interview, not even a combative one. I genuinely have questions and would come from it from a respectful place with someone who's involved in the process of getting stuff on there. Cause I would really love to know everything that goes on, and there might be reasons for why stuff isn't there that I'm not aware of. I would love to know. Anyway. The last thing I want to say, I want to talk about your podcast too, but just as far as your reading project, I felt so bad when I covered the Rebirth era. I wanted to love it as much as you and other people have. Okay. I really wanted to, but that's the thing. And like I said in those episodes, I know there are others out there who got more out of it. And so I'm not one of them, but I'm glad that, look at this journey that it set you on. So it's wonderful.
Well, not only do I really like the Rebirth era, I'm reading the Bendis era for the second time around, and I like it a whole lot more than I did the first time, and I know that hurts your soul.
It's fine. Again, I always say, I never begrudge anyone their enjoyment, and when I don't like something, I'm glad when someone else does, because otherwise, if no one then it's like, why is this even there, right? As long as someone's getting something out of it, that's cool. So you started this podcast. And how long has it been now? About a year? A little bit more?
It's been just over a year. I did my 1 year anniversary episode 2 weeks ago.
So Truth, Justice, and Hope is the podcast.
Truth, Justice, and Hope, right. And the tagline of the show is the modern era of Superman comics from a humanist perspective in real life through the lens of a Superman fan. So like you said, I started with technically Convergence, and then the Lois and Clark miniseries and on forward. And I do 2 episodes. 2 issues an episode. I do an episode every week. And then I have a segment at the beginning of the show called My Thoughts from the Fortress of Solitude, which is about humanist ethics, really. And so it's just my thoughts on everything from getting Father's Day presents up to the other end of the spectrum, like recent decisions out of the Supreme Court, and just my thoughts on the ethics of things and how it makes you feel and how you deal with it. And, in terms of, positive solutions you can take to real world problems sometimes. And I do get into politics sometimes a little more than I'm comfortable with, and I'm trying to dial that back, but I'm not going to stop talking about it because I think that's what Superman would do. So,
I know I heard you talk about that with Tyler, and it's something that I thought of too, especially reading and listening to the stories that we did for this, and the importance of taking a stand and being vocal. And, I rarely touch on politics on the show for a couple of reasons. One, I think for myself and for a lot of us who are, reading and watching and consuming this podcast, where, it's an escape, right? And so there's that element that I want to try to preserve, but I'll also admit that, and I hate to say this, I'm kind of embarrassed to say it, there's also this feeling of, well, if I express my view on something and someone doesn't agree, am I going to catch flack for it? Am I going to lose
my listeners?
Yep. And it's one of those things, but at the same time, I think, I don't think anyone would mistake me for a Trump supporter. I certainly hope not. Right. I hope I've at least made that clear. If not, I'll say it now.
Right.
But yeah, it's one of those things where, there's definitely these stories were inspiring. I don't know that I would necessarily change the way I do the show, but if and when the next opportunity comes up to express something, I don't know, I might not couch it so delicately because I think there is something to, especially, I don't know, I've thought about this a lot over recent years. It's one thing when, you're having a healthy debate on an issue, but I feel like so much of what we've been living through, from my perspective, at least, it's like, there's certain things you can't defend. It's not a matter of opinion. It's like when you are hurting groups of people and actively working against, that's not a matter of, we have a difference of political opinion. I do think we get into areas of genuine right and wrong. And so,
exactly.
But anyway, and so especially going through these stories that really sparked, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, because I felt like this really was a great tie-in, and again ties in
right in my wheelhouse. Yeah.
And just on a, as far as the plugs go, Truth, Justice, and Hope is available on all major podcast platforms.
Yeah, I do it through Anchor, so it's anchor.fm/truth, justice, and hope. Excuse me. But it's also, Google, Apple, Amazon, Stitcher, all the majors. Yeah.
It's funny. I've talked about this here and there, but it's so cool connecting with other Superman podcasters. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because when I first started the show, not that I had any reservation, but there are, even when I started now, 2 years ago, it's like there were plenty of other Superman podcasts out there. So it's like, well, and what I ended up finding is that not only is it, at least from what I've experienced, not only is it not competitive, but I feel like a lot of us Superman podcasters are each other's biggest supporters and audience members, which is really cool. I would not have expected that.
Yes, it's a very supportive fandom. It's so nice. There's very little toxicity in it. And I think what little toxicity is comes from those people who don't really consume the media. They have their own idea that they've put into place, or are bots.
Sure. As far as table setting goes, the last thing I want to say about Smashes the Klan in particular, and I'm always, on this show, I'm always quick to admit when I've been wrong about something. And this is another example. I've talked about this before with Superman 78, for example. When I talked about that, I was like, I initially avoided this. For whatever reason, I have this bias against comic book adaptations or continuations of movies or TV shows. I couldn't explain why. Similarly, because I was saying to myself, why did I never read Superman Smashes the Klan? I remember all the acclaim that it got. Came out a few years ago now, 2019. Mm-hmm. And I hate to say it, I think it was the young adults label. I think I looked at it as like, this is going to be a kid's book, and it's something that works for all ages. And I kick myself because I have comic creator friends who do all ages books. I understand the difference between an all ages book that can work for all levels versus a true kids book, which is really aimed at a young audience. But I think I saw that young adult label on it, and I just felt like, this, it's not for me. It's not going to hold my interest. I never read it. And I wish I had gotten to it earlier. Did you read it at the time, or was this newer for you?
I wasn't even I wasn't even reading DC in 2019 when this came out. I read it for the first time really just recently. I got the graphic novel of it for Father's Day. And so I burned through it really fast. I'm right with you though. If I had seen this on the shelf, I wouldn't have got it because I've got it right. It's really small. Like it's definitely a young adult sized book. I read it digitally, and then I kind of supplemented with the hard copy. But yeah, if I'd seen this on the shelf, I probably wouldn't have gotten it just because of the size. Because I'm like, that's what I associate with like when Runaways from Marvel first hit the shelves as a graphic. It was tiny. It looked like something you could put in your pocket. And so I was like, I probably would have passed that. But luckily I saw it digitally first. I was like, and I love the art team, Gurihiru's art, because I used to read Unstoppable Wasp with my daughter, and they did the art on that, which was great. And so, I was actually really drawn to the art, and I had no idea it was even supposed to be young adult until after I'd gotten the hard copy and go, well, there's a little young adult tag on the back. That's neat.
So when you got it for Father's Day and read it, then you had not yet listened to the radio show, correct?
I had started listening to the radio show a while ago, stopped it, and then picked it up again maybe early June. So yeah.
Yeah, it's just interesting because I definitely feel like I got more out of the comic having listened to the radio show first. You know, I'm curious to know what it would be like. Again, I'm sure it still works on its own, and I know clearly Smashes the Klan was really popular, and I doubt everyone who was reading it had listened to the radio show, but it was definitely fascinating. Again, they really are on similar tracks here, not huge differences, although the comic definitely adds a lot, a far more prominent role for Lois. We introduce a sister for Tommy Lee, and Superman has his own arc in this, where he really does not.
Much bigger arc for Inspector Henderson too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as a black man in the comic, which adds a whole other component.
Yeah, whose role in the radio show is often just to tell Clark Kent that he's crazy. You don't know what you're talking about, Kent. Much more supportive role in the comic.
Yes, for sure. So yeah, it definitely fleshes out a lot. But the radio show really holds up.
It does.
And I'll say that the big picture thing, and I'm sure we'll keep coming back to this idea. It's heartbreaking to listen to the radio show and know how frustratingly relevant it all still is today.
Yes, how little has changed, or the way I think of it is things looked better for a while. It's just the scorpion was sleeping. The referring to the grand scorpion of the fiery cross, like the reference, the dragon was sleeping, whereas all this kind of simmering under the surface and broke out in the last 7 years. But yeah, it's frustrating how either it's not changed at all or it's cycled back around to it.
So much so, and I don't say this to Monday morning quarterback Smashes the Klan, but part of me wonders, because the comic is set in the same time period as the radio show in 1946. And, I love seeing that golden age era of the character. Yeah. That was actually one of our patron questions. Brian Dempsey asked, would I want to see Gene Yang write more stories of golden age Superman? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But part of me, and let me ask you this, again, there's something to be said for, honoring the original time period of the radio show and all that. But part of me wonders, would it not have been better served by setting it in the present day, or would that have been too on the nose? Like, do you like this, the time period that the book is set in?
I like the time period. I like how in the comic, Yang takes Superman's power set from the beginning of the Golden Age, where he was just strong and could, was fast and could jump really far, and then incorporated a in-story reason for how his powers developed. I think that was neat. I think you kind of need to do that in the 30s if you're going to do it. I mean, I know it's obviously an alternate reality story, but plus like you said, I just like seeing Superman in that time. I like seeing a modern interpretation of the Golden Age. I think it's really neat. I think it's really cool. And like you said, it might have been too on the nose. I think it might have turned, some people off. It might have been like, I don't want to take it that seriously, so yeah. I think that a good balance.
I think that's fair enough. I'll also say, I think as much as I enjoyed the comic story, I was so impressed by the essay that Yang wrote that was spread across the back of all 3 books, talking about the history of the Klan and his personal history as well, and that of his family. It was really interesting, to get a little bit more historical context, but also to get more of a sense of where, he was coming from in all of this. So I thought, for anyone who hasn't read the book at all, but certainly if you haven't read the that essay at the back of the 3 issues, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's really touching. I think he's been through a lot, and he has such a positive outlook on things in general, and just in everything he's written. I'm just very impressed with him as both a writer and a person.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say too, especially when I was listening to the radio show, and thinking my own experience. So I'm a straight white man. There's a lot that I've been fortunate to not experience, but my wife is Chinese and our son is half Chinese. And, So it definitely resonated with me in a way that it wouldn't necessarily have a few years ago. And, it broke my heart in a lot of ways. And, there are slurs against the Chinese community that are said. It's softened a little bit in the comic, but still there. But you hear it, more in the radio show. And, it's one of those things that it's like, some point my son will likely hear that. I don't know what the context or the intent will be, but at some point it'll have to be addressed. And, I hate that. It breaks my heart. So, again, especially listening to it, it really, it hit me in a way that, like I said, a few years ago, it still would have resonated. Don't get me wrong, but it struck home. It hit home in a bigger way.
Yeah. And, like I'm at the same place with you. I'm a straight white male and in my middle ages. Life is, weirdly, unfortunately canted to my privilege, but I have very close family members who are young and are queer, and I know that they are going to grow up with those same prejudices, and it's they're not going to be able to live their authentic self in a lot of circumstances, which really is awful and breaks my heart. But so all I can do is be a supportive, a source of support for them.
Yeah. Well, while on this note of, speaking out about things, my perspective kind of widened over the past few years, especially with respect to representation in comics. And so I do another show called My Comic Shop History, and I did a documentary called My Comic Shop Country, and I went to all these shops. And one of the ones I went to is a store that very sadly recently announced that they're closing, but it's Amalgam Comics and Coffee House in Philadelphia. And it's owned and operated, is the only comic shop on the East Coast owned and operated by a Black woman. And the first time I interviewed her, I did it once for the podcast and then again for the documentary. But the first time I spoke with her, she gave me her origin story and talked about how she got into this world through Storm with the X-Men, and how as a young Black girl, there were so few instances of seeing herself represented in the pages of a comic or in the cartoons or in the movies. And, I think it just, I don't know, hearing her tell that story, it kind of made me think about how I've not had to think about that, right? Like for me, there's no shortage of people who look like me in the stories that I consume, but I can imagine what it would be like if that weren't. And so you see why it's so meaningful. So, when these debates come up about about representation in comics, it's like, you got to take a step back and imagine what it's like for people who don't see themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm the same way. I mean, for so long, I didn't think about it. Like for a while, my favorite superhero was, I've always had to have a favorite superhero since I was a little kid. That's just how my brain's wired. And for a long time, it was Steve Rogers. And I was like, well, I tend to lean towards this guy because, I can relate to him. And then I started thinking like, well, I don't necessarily need to relate to a character to like them. And that's a very narrow-minded point of view. And so I really started expanding and, like outside of Superman, like my next favorite character recently is Sojourner Mullein from the Green Lantern. So there's just such a wide variety of characters out there now. We happen to like a white male character, but that doesn't mean we can't like so many others.
Absolutely. Let's take a quick commercial break and then we'll pick this back up. We'll be right back. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere, via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, which happens to be my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Aw yeah. And we're back. All right, so going back to Clan of the Fiery Cross, I mean, I guess just, as you're listening to these 16 episodes, it was a 16-chapter story, each one with commercials, about 15 minutes or so. I didn't listen to the Kellogg's Pep commercial every time. Yeah. I would skip ahead a little bit. So
I made myself listen to it a couple of times because it's so funny. The ones in the other story arcs are even funnier, where they're promoting like mail-in things or prizes in the cereal. It's hilarious. You can send in for your very own sundial wristwatch, kids.
It's amazing. So, cutting out the commercials, that saved a little bit of time. And I actually found that they went very quickly. They really moved. Oh, I don't want to forget this, because in the episode I did with Tyler about the movie serials, we talked. Have you seen the serials?
I have not.
Okay.
They're on my list of things to do, but I sit down so rarely to watch TV that's not high on the list.
So this probably won't help matters. We talked about how, I won't rehash the whole episode, but we talked about how not just formulaic, but repetitive they were, to the point where I said it was like, it felt like I was stuck in a loop, in a time loop. Like it was just the same sort of back and forth between Clark and Lois and Jimmy and the bad guys, chapter after chapter after chapter. And so going into the radio serial, I was like, oh, is this going to be a similar type of thing? I was very pleasantly surprised. Not a ton happens necessarily in a lot of these. Like, one of the chapters might be, little Chuck Riggs, trying to decide whether to come forward with the information that will help save Tommy Lee. And, Clark is trying to get a handle on where Jimmy and Perry have been taken. And that might be it for that chapter, but it moved forward. Every chapter had some forward movement. This might not seem like a lot, but after coming out of those serials, the movie serials, I was kind of beaten down by those. And so this was kind of refreshing where, I think it was between the recaps and again, not a ton of ground covered in each episode. I could see where if you missed a day, you wouldn't be lost for the remainder of the episodes, a la the movie serial, same type of thing where you wouldn't necessarily go to the serial, see the serial every week. So it had that going for it, but it didn't have that repetition that the movie did. And it just felt like we were moving forward each time. I appreciated that.
Yeah. There were 2 things that the radio show did for this arc that I thought was really, really smart. In the way that the comic series was young adults, and obviously the show was probably aimed at kids anyway, but it framed it around a thing that was popular with boys, at least, which is probably their main target audience. It frames it around baseball. Hey Jimmy, you like baseball. These baseball players don't like racism. You shouldn't like racism too. And the other thing I thought was really savvy, it's almost devious. They don't mention the fact that Tommy is Chinese until like episode 5 or 6 of the series. They get you to care about Tommy and his family as characters before they even mention it. It's like, well, they say something about Chuck refers to Tommy as like a yellow banana, and the way you frame it, it comes across as like yellow is like being a chicken, right? Being a coward. But you don't find out he's Chinese until you've established this Tommy's a good dude. And so really smart to maybe take, because like I said, my grandpa's still around. He was a kid in that time. I have to deal with the fact that my grandpa's kind of a racist. So I'm sure there was some casual racism that was very prevalent at the time. And so making them people first and then dealing with the race second was really, really clever.
I agree 1,000%. And I clocked that as well. It was episodes in to Clan of the Fiery Cross, where before Jimmy is finally talking to Clark and he's like, why are they targeting Tommy Lee? And it's at that point that Clark says, because they're Chinese. It took multiple chapters. I agree. I thought that was such a great choice. That definitely, that definitely registered with me. It's like, oh, we're taking our time with this. But again, I think, exactly for the reasons that you said, and they did that to great effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I got brain stuck there for a second. I don't think they mentioned their nationality until episode 6. And I think in episode 5 was when Jimmy is talking to Dr. Lee. He says, why are they targeting you, Dr. Lee? And Dr. Lee says, if you don't know, I can't explain it to you, which was really, I knew by then because I think I read Smashes the Klan first, but I'm like, oh, wow, that's kind of powerful. If you can't figure out racism on your own, Jimmy, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. So, and throughout the radio show, all of our heroes, Clark, Jimmy, Perry, and the narrator, right?
Yes.
It's the narrator is not an impartial, objective narrator here. No. It's very clear that these are closed-minded bigots, and good Americans evaluate people based on their character and their qualities, not on where they're from or what church they go to, or, as they say over and over, how they part their hair.
Right. Like I made notes about things the narrator said. One, because I really like how pulpy some of the narration is. But in the first episode, he refers to, the Klan as an evil fire and evil subversive forces. And then when Chuck first takes Tommy to the Klan meeting, the narration says, in a glade casting weird shadows over the nearby hills and lighting the sky above burns a huge wooden cross. Before it kneel 100 men clothed in long robes, pointed hoods slit only at the eyes cover their faces, and a low guttural chant issues harshly from their hidden lips. They lean in so hard to a big theme of Pulp Fiction is like the evil death cult. And they really lean into that. There is no good people on both sides of this story, which was kind of what I was expecting, honestly, going into it. It's like, well, they're bad guys and they do bad guy things, but so are a lot of other bad guys. No, these are evil, evil people, and they do not mince words about it, which is, I loved it. I was like, yep, give me more of this show.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I wasn't expecting that. I really wasn't expecting anything. I didn't know what I was really getting going into the story. And so, to see how emphatically they made the point that they made in this was really striking. But at the same time, I mean, I still wouldn't describe it as preachy. It's like it really told the story through the characters, and especially through our young characters. And the Jimmy Olsen in this, right, is a kid. Mm-hmm. He, just as we'll see in Smashes the Klan. I mean, he's a kid. He's the manager of the Unity House baseball team.
Cub reporter. Yeah.
Yeah. I think and I agree with you, this is not a very fine people on both sides sort of thing, but where, you do see some redemption, some chance for growth is with little Chuck Riggs.
Chuck. Yeah.
Right. What's the uncle's name again? Max or Martin or
Matt
Riggs. But with little Chuck, like that's where you see the opportunity to, to kind of bring someone to the other side of hate. So I appreciate that. That was one thing that I thought the radio show did a bit more effectively in the conversation between Chuck and his uncle when Chuck is talking about getting beaned by Tommy at baseball practice. The radio show spent the time, like you really see how a kid comes to learn hate and racism through this uncle just
gaslighting him.
Gaslighting him and just like beating this into his head of like, no, Tommy did this on purpose. That's what his people are like. He's trying to steal your spot on the team. We're going to go to the meeting and we're going to tell everyone about this. There's also this business, right, that Tommy's father, Dr. Lee, right, he's the new chief bacteriologist at the Metropolis Health Department. So there's that going on too. And the comic plays that up even more, where you see, a little bit more about, that side of it. But so that there's also that mixed up in this, right? So that this Chinese family has moved out of Chinatown into this, white area of Metropolis. And, Tommy's taking over the spot as the pitcher on the baseball team. And his father is now in this prominent position for the
health department.
Yeah. But I thought that the radio show, when you listen to that uncle like beating the story into his nephew's head and twisting it, and you see how that could happen. That still plays out in the comic, but I thought the radio show really did an effect. They spent the time there.
Yeah, I was really struck by the difference between the Chuck's mom in the radio show and Chuck's mom in the comic. Because Chuck's mom in the comic is like, well, the Klan does some rough stuff, but is it really that bad to want to live among your own kind? And Chuck's mom in the radio show is like, those people are no worse than Nazis. And that's who your father died fighting, Chuck. And it lays into the fact that the radio show goes around, it goes out of its way to compare the Klan to Nazis. It's like, yep, I'm right there with you.
Yeah, it was interesting to see that difference. We touched on this before, but the comic gives Superman an arc in this where he's exposed to kryptonite for the first time, and it's triggering these memories and these visions of his birth parents, and eventually leads to the unlocking of his full power set, right? And this idea that he had been holding himself back because he has these memories from being a kid. The first time he got angry and he levitated and he used his heat vision, the Bravermans. Now, as a fan of Conduit, as a fan of Conduit from the 90s, I love the Bravermans being in there. But like Kenny and Kyle Braverman, the town bullies. I know. Their mother, she's like, Clark's a demon.
He's a demon. Yeah.
These are memories that Clark has repressed, and he's suppressed these, this aspect of his powers, and it leads to some interesting conversation with Roberta, Tommy's sister, in this about how, and this actually ties in with something I was saying when we did our, you haven't heard this yet based on when we're recording, but when I covered New 52 Superman and how at the beginning of the Morrison run, he's really that Golden Age-esque depowered version of the character. And what I said there is exactly what Roberta articulates in the comic of, when Superman's powers are more modest, you don't necessarily have that fear from the public about either, even if you don't get into the fact that he's an alien, but just this idea of someone having that much power. It's like, and like Roberta says, well, people can be strong. You're just stronger. People can be fast. You're faster. But when you're shooting fire from your eyes, it's a whole different ball game. Did you like that arc that it gave Clark in the comic?
I did. It was jarring at first. Because like I said, I kind of started reading the comic and I went back and listened to the show, and I was like, well, this very deviates so much from the radio show. But the more I read it, the more I liked it, the more I got it. Especially when he first sees the hallucinations of his parents, which turn into his birth parents, and where they're the green-skinned alien with antennas, look like a Greedo from Star Wars almost, and that repressed hallucination is based on the pulp magazine that he was reading when he first manifested his powers, when he was getting picked on by Kenny Braverman, or when Pete Ross was getting picked on by Kenny Braverman. And so that was really, the more I read it, the more I liked it, because it was really clever. I think it was really well done.
That was ultimately the place I got to as well. I think, my initial reaction was, I don't know if we need this. And that's
Mhm.
not a criticism of the story. It's a testament to how invested I was in
Mhm.
in the Lee family and the
Yeah.
Unity House baseball team where,
Mhm.
because again, in the radio show, obviously Clark is there and Superman too, but Superman is used sparingly. It was reminiscent of the George Reeves show where most of the
Mhm.
episode would be Clark and Lois and Jimmy investigating as reporters, and then they
Right.
would get in a jam and he would have to change it to Superman and save them for the last couple of minutes.
Mhm.
So similar in the Clan of the Fiery Cross where, and even Clark is used somewhat sparingly. I mean, a lot of
Sparingly,
it is
yeah.
Chuck and Tommy and
Jimmy
Jimmy.
and
Jimmy gets a lot of play. And
yeah.
Perry, which I
Mhm.
always like.
Yeah, that version of Perry's great. He's like almost he's comedically grouchy.
Yes. Although, there's that whole stretch in the radio show where, Perry is writing these editorials and offering rewards for information on the identity of the Klansmen. And, of course, the Fiery Cross it won't stand for that. And so they kidnap Perry and Jimmy. And, Perry is just like, no, they won't do anything to us. They won't. As the
Yeah.
situation gets increasingly worse, and he's just like, no,
Mhm.
they won't do anything. It's like, buddy, I think you got to take
Yeah.
this a little
You
bit
were
more
coming at this
seriously
from a
here.
position of privilege, Perry. One thing I thought was really funny about the rewards, I looked up what because first it starts out as it starts out as 1,000 and works its way up to 5,000. $1,000 in 1946 would be $21,000 today, and 5,000 would be $75,000 today. So the planet was rolling in it in 1940s. Apparently,
The planet
Perry
was
had some scratch.
the planet was the place to be. I always think about that when, watching the George Reeves show or listening to something like this. It was again, that was the place to be. The resources were quite vast. I always think about how, they're always flying two reporters and a photographer to all of these locations. And I'm just thinking about
Mhm.
the expense report for something like this. So yeah, I guess, but yeah, I appreciate you doing the math. Cause yeah, that was quite the sum.
Yeah. One thing you were saying about how little they actually play off of Superman, he doesn't appear till episode 6. Well, he doesn't appear as Superman. He zips around in his civilian clothes and does a couple of superhuman feats, but he doesn't strip out of his Clark identity and put on the blue uniform and red cape of Superman which is when Tommy disappears from the show, weirdly enough.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and Tommy doesn't after Tommy breaks his arm, he's not in the show anymore, but that's whatever.
Yes. I
But yeah,
mean,
it's surprisingly little play for Superman in the actual drama.
exactly. But it still works. I mean, like that's the thing.
Mhm.
Such a testament to the story they were telling, where I was invested in the other characters. And so when we got to the comic, I know this is a weird thing to say as a Superman fan on a Superman podcast, but I just sort of felt like I don't know that I necessarily need to see him uncovering his origin. However,
Yeah.
to your point, as I made my way through, and you see thematically how this ties in, and he has to accept who he is, accept himself
Mhm.
and his otherness.
Right.
Just as our other characters do as well. And yes, as a fan, it was I did appreciate the use of kryptonite here. How
Mhm.
even though yes, it does have this negative effect, it hurts him, but it also is unlocking
Yeah.
these things that he had buried. So I thought that was a cool take on it. And yes, as a fan of the Golden Age version of the character, it was cool to see an in-story explanation for
Mhm.
how he went from that Golden Age version to the more
Right.
powered iteration of the character that we know. So yeah, it was cool. And the Kents were alive, which I appreciate. And I assume they were not going to be in this, and I was so happy
I
when he saw them.
Yeah, I love Mom and Pa being alive. It warms my heart.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so his arc, I thought, it definitely worked and tied into, to what was going on. What else stood out to you about either of these stories?
Just just little things from the comic were really neat. Like I love when he gives Roberta his cape, and then she takes it home and uses it as a blanket first, and then there was this big deal about she had this jacket that she wore all the time in Chinatown because she had really really bad anxiety, and then she threw up on it, so her mom had to throw it out, and then her mom takes Superman's cape and makes it into her new kind of confidence jacket. I thought that was really great. Little things about the artwork, like when he in the comic, when he first appears at the ball game and he has his full powers and he's floating above the ball field. And I tweeted about this because a lot of times when artists use the red eyes to show that Superman is what at least righteously indignant, he looks like a murder god. But here, it's his head is positioned slightly in front of the sun, and it looks like the sun light is coming through his eyes. And there was something really, really powerful about that. And just, I thought I love the parallels between, I forget what the head of the Klan's name is, Cedric Wilson. I loved, the parallels between in the radio show, Matt goes to Wilson's house and says, look, we've been routed. The other Klansmen have been arrested. You need to get help. And in both of them, the head of the Klan says, look, this is a money-making scam. And you bought into the line that we sell to the rubes to get them to give us $10, which, back in the 1940s would have been like probably $150. And, I love the parallels, but, but then of course in the comic, it's he tries to use like a kryptonite gun to kill Matt, which Matt knocks out of his hand. And in both of them, he chokes the other guy to death. When they match up, when they align perfectly, it's really, really powerful if you've listened and read both.
I'm glad you brought that up with the Imperial Mogul that Matt speaks with. The comic book version was fine, but I felt that the busting out of the kryptonite weapon and this larger, this larger plan to target Superman, I felt like it took a little bit away from the power of the moment. Because when I was listening to that radio show, and you get to that point, exactly what you described, where, Riggs is this true believer, hate flowing through his veins. He wants 100% Americans only, right?
Right.
And exactly like you said, the mogul is like, oh, like we're trying to make money here. And that was one of the standout moments where I was like, this is so sophisticated and clever. And not to make it sound like I wouldn't expect anything like that, but especially knowing that it was made, so many years ago for a young audience, I was so blown away because it showed in one fell swoop, right? It shows this group, the Klan, that you do have people with genuinely hateful hearts. And you also have, particularly at the very top, people who are these ideological black holes who are just trying to make money, a la our last president.
Exactly. I was thinking, in this case, in the show, he got choked out. In real life, 200,000 of them stormed the Capitol. It's true believers are scary, and it's people who are trying to make money off of them that lead them into the scariest places. Right.
And it's, look, I'll continue on this track for a moment, especially when we're talking about the last guy in the Oval Office. It's like all of the people who he is pandering to, he wouldn't be caught dead with any of them in any other type of scenario than a rally where they're cheering for him.
Right.
Yet, this movement has built up around him. And so, seeing those parallels, it was, it was eerie. And again, eerie, but also heartbreaking that this continues to play out. But yeah, I prefer the radio version. And I just felt like, man, like this really is really making the case against the Klan in every way it can, and really trivializing, especially in that respect, right? And really undermining this image that they're trying to put out there. It was astounding.
Well, I think, I did a lot of research on the backstory behind the story too. And the actual radio company, they had someone infiltrate the Klan back in the 40s, and they learned all the ins and outs, and they learned all their rituals, and they wanted to demystify it. They wanted people to see how ridiculous it is. In the scene where Matt takes Chuck to the meeting, he says, okay, now we're going to make the sigil of and it's some silly word, the sigil of the thingy on his chest. And it's just like, okay. And a lot of it is just, it's not this great dark cult of mysticism. It's just a bunch of goobers in their work boots and their sheets out in the woods. And they're here to take, and it's just a scam to get your money. And it's impressive. It's impressive how much work they put into this back in the 40s.
I didn't do as much research as you did, but allegedly this radio show did hurt recruitment efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it put him back like 20 years. And by the time they were able to start making a comeback, it was when kind of things were turning around the other way with the civil rights movement. So it really hurt them for a long, long time.
Yeah, I love that a Superman story was used in this way, because as has been said, and you and I agree, that Superman is for everyone.
Yes.
And so to see a story where it's at the forefront like that was really powerful. And actually, going back to the arc that Superman has, it did add another dimension to it, because Superman is white, and it plays out more in the comic where Riggs and the other Klansmen look to Superman almost as an ally initially, right? Because he looks like them.
a big Superman fan starting out,
right. And so this revelation that he's not from here, and he is this other, you see that commonality between him and the people he's defending, and really draws that line, between him and those who would look at him as a hero in the wrong context. So yeah, no, I thought,
and
that
they
really
show
worked.
how his fears actually played out in real life when he shows up at the ball field with his full powers, when he's floating there shooting heat vision. Most of the adults turn on him. They're like, he's an alien, get him, Grand Scorpion. And it's the kids, most of the kids, they're like, no, that's our Superman. They have that one kid that goes, he doesn't smell like cotton candy, he smells like ashes. One kid that was obsessed with him and wanted to know what he smelled like. But yeah, most of the adults do actually turn him, and there's not a turnaround for that. There's not it's the adults stay anti-Superman to the end of the story, and it's the kids who stay pro-Superman, which is pretty fascinating.
I got to give it to the comic also for fleshing out the Lee family, giving the both parents more to do, and introducing the sister, and also keeping Tommy a part of the story throughout. Right. Because like you said, in the radio show, there are a number of attempts against the Lees, and basically they all play out to some degree or another in the comic as well. But first the Klan, burns the cross in their lawn, and there's an attempt to blow up the bicycle at one point as well in the radio show.
Instead of a car bomb, it's a bicycle bomb.
Yeah, a bicycle bomb.
Again, relating to what kids can relate to,
Right.
Your mom and dad might not have a car, but you got a bike, Billy.
Exactly. And this attempt to abduct and tar and feather, and in both instances, Tommy's able to, both the comic and the radio show, he's able to escape and jump out of the car, but he breaks his arm, and then he retreats into the river, and that necessitates the rescue from Superman. And like you said, at that point in the radio show, he's pretty much done. And most of the action then shifts towards the Klan targeting Perry and Jimmy. Two white guys, and and then a lot of it becomes about saving them. So I did like how the Lees remain more prominent in the comic story, and that even when Perry is abducted, it's with Henderson, who again is a black man in the comic.
Right. And I like there's a little bit when Clark is trying to convince Dr. Lee in the radio show to stay around. Dr. Lee wants to leave town, which as a parent I totally get. If my wife and my kid were in danger, we're like, we're going to go, somebody else can be the hero. I need to protect my family. But he's saying, Clark is saying, well, we'll get police protection. And Dr. Lee says the police might be in on it. And in the comic, you see that's true. That we have the one cop that's helps Riggs escape, and then pulls a gun on Inspector Henderson and says, well, you don't have your badge now. And as we're seeing from, people that are getting indicted for the 1/6 insurrection, some cops were in on it. I'm not an all cops are bad person. I worked in a line of work that was tangential law enforcement for 16 years, but it's an unfortunate thing.
I appreciated that the comic went there with that cop, for example, because to your point, in the radio show, virtually everyone except the Klan's members are on the side of righteousned for the most part, right? Which again, I think for the audience at the time made sense, but doesn't reflect, sad to say, the reality of what it is. And so with the comic, and even whether it's the casual racism of, the kids at the clubhouse, or the fellow scientists who come to greet the lead. Now, of course, we find out that they are members of the Fiery Cross, but initially, you don't know that. And, the remarks that they make as well. So yeah, I think the comic really painted the fuller picture of what's going on, and how it's not just the ones, in those hoods.
Yeah. It's much more nuance. I appreciate the show trying to idealize it, to kind of put that idealism in the kids' heads, but I think kids today are a lot more savvy, and I think making it more nuanced works much better with modern kids. Modern kids are really, really smart. They pick up on these things, when I sit down and watch the political news, my 11-year-old daughter sits down and watches it with me. So, kids get it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to think, there other things that stood out, just on a lighter note, but the use of the word sorehead to describe Chuck. I like that not in use anymore, but you see that a lot, and they use it in the comic as well.
Won't cooperate.
Sorehead.
I love a lot of those, old timey things. Listening to some of the dialogue, it reminds me, like I said, my grandpa's still alive, and I spent more time with my grandfather than I did with my parents as a kid. And they're like, man, that's like listening to my grandpa talk. And it's really neat, just like when Clark is trying to convince someone of something, and he says, I tell you it is. And then Perry goes, well, I tell you it's not. And it's just based on his opinion. He's like, I tell you it's not. And I just thought that was really funny. Something I can relate to from, nostalgia. Did you catch the mention of Luthor in the comic?
Oh, I don't think I did.
There's a really brief mention of Luthor. I don't remember where. I think it's in issue 2. Somewhere in it, Superman saying, well, I don't know who would do this. Maybe it's Luthor, or maybe Der Teufel. And I had to look up who Der Teufel is. Der Teufel is a Nazi scientist who creates the radio show version of Atom Man.
Ah, okay.
And so Yang was pulling from multiple sources when he put this together.
Oh, now that you say, I do remember the Luthor mention, but it didn't register a second ago. But yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I love all these polls. It's great to be. And look, there's so much history to mine, so it's nice, especially like that's the thing. You often see polls from, the Christopher Reeve movies, or things that are, are so prevalent. But to kind of go back to this earlier time, there's a lot there. I would imagine there, with over 2,000 episodes, I'm sure there's so much more that is ripe for a revival.
And I've when I read that, I was like, okay. I knew, I assumed that the Atom Man in the comic was based on the the movie serial version that you and Tyler watched and talked about. And apparently they're very different. The one from the movie serial, from what I understand, is really Luthor in disguise. Is that right?
Yeah.
This is a radioactive Nazi. Basically, it's very much like the comic version. So I was like, okay, well, I want to listen to that. And I started listening to it, and then I said, well, this spins out of this previous story about the Scarlet Widow. I was like, okay, I got to listen to that. Well, that spins out of this previous story that introduced kryptonite. So there's this, these like 50 to 100 episodes that are back to back that all line up, in an order. And I was like, this is so cool. It's such a deep well. And, I've just fallen down it completely.
I mean, like I said, I expect that I'll listen to more as well. Certainly, if you have recommendations on either individual episodes or arcs, please feel free to let me know, because it was, like I said, I really love the form, and it's different, and again, a largely untapped area for me when it comes to Superman. Yeah. So it's just like it's so much to explore. That's I think why going back to this there's so many Superman podcasts. It's like, well, with an 80+ year mythology, there's a lot, there's an awful lot. There's room for it.
Yeah. I mean, that is, is one thing. It's like, okay, you may have to look a little bit to find your niche to make your show stand out, but you're not going to have to look very hard, because it's a huge, arena to choose from. So.
What else about either of these versions of the story that we haven't touched on did you want to talk about?
I think that about sums it up. Let me let me flip through my notes really quick that I took a lot of. Again, I thought it was really smart that that they bookend it with baseball. You know, trying to make it relatable to kids. It starts with the baseball game that sets the whole thing off with Chuck accidentally getting beamed, and then it comes back around to the baseball championship, and it's just like just high baseball drama about racism, which is pretty fascinating.
Well, while you look, I'll just say to your point, I do,
Sure.
the baseball piece of it is kind of a little bit lost on me. I'm not into sports. Yeah. I used to be into basketball in elementary school, and then that sort of faded. I was really into it at the time, but anyway. So, but hearing you talk about it, it's true. I mean, I think it's like Superman and baseball. If you need, I don't know if you could come up with a better vehicle for delivering a story like that than with those two pieces. And the bookend, the baseball as bookends, I think works nicely. It definitely works better in the comic because that's where you have the culmination of Clark's own journey through this. Whereas in the radio show, it sort of felt like, I don't know, like we've already reached the high point here and now it's like just sort of continue. But when you go to the comic and it's like, no, like there's really something that needs to happen here for, for Clark in particular, it ties it all together and it's a worthy payoff. The other thing too, it's minimal here, but along with Lois's enhanced role in this, you do get a couple of nice moments with Clark and Lois. And there's a scene where they're, at a restaurant together or something like that. And, he's starting to have visions of his parents and he's looking past Lois and she thinks he's looking at another woman and she gets mad and she storms off. And he's like, why would I look at anyone else when I'm already talking to the smartest, prettiest, most fearless woman in the world? It's like, it breaks your heart for him. Stuff like that was really nice.
One thing I also really like, going back to what you were saying about the baseball game, for anyone that hasn't listened to them or read them, in the radio show, it just ends with, all the Klansmen get arrested. The Grand Scorpion escapes and he gets a hunting rifle and he's gonna just pick off his own nephew and Perry and Jimmy at the baseball game and Superman stops him. The end. Like you said, it's very anticlimactic. In the comic, he shows up with this like Cable from Marvel gun strapped to his back that's loaded with kryptonite, and he's this onslaught of kryptonite weapons and a kryptonite dagger, and it like you said, it really makes much more of a satisfying climax where Superman's up against more or less a super villain by the end of the story. But one other thing I thought was really cute, it's at the very beginning of issue 3 of the comic series where he's having a flashback. He's having a memory of when he went to the circus as a kid, and he's seeing the Flying Graysons, which I thought was really neat. That was a lot of fun. It really makes me hope that Yang does a spin-off of this, because there is a Superman Batman crossover in the radio show, which I would love to see an adaptation of. But I also like it when he has this talk with the strongman, because this lion runs amok and he saves the strongman. He's like, Clark's maybe 17 years old, and he sits down with the strongman. He's like, look, people don't recognize me when I'm not being the strongman. I'm just the ticket guy. But when I put on a flashy outfit, which is like a red bodysuit with blue trunks and blue boots, people look at me completely different. And so, that's where he gets the inspiration to do the costume. And it's the word strongman is written in bold words so many times. That's put right next to the S on his costume. It's like, was the implication that what he was thinking about calling himself strongman? But who knows?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I love that too, because, we all, again, appreciating the history of the character, know that, that was an inspiration for the costume, but to see that play out in the context of the story where he's at the circus and having that conversation was really cool. Yeah, that was, like I said, part of me does wonder, like I said at the top, maybe could this have been set in present day? But I enjoy the 1946 setting. And I think what's especially cool about it is, like, I love that version of the character, but so to sort of take that and then infuse it with, with other elements of the mythology, like kryptonite, like the emerging powers, like the Kent still being there, like Lana, like to take that earliest version of the character and flesh it out like that, it really is, it has its own flavor.
Yeah.
And is really cool. So yeah, like you could still do it the thing now where goes to the circus, but it definitely feels more organic and natural in that setting.
Yes. And like you said, I love just a little bit of Kenny Braverman there. It was funny. It was fun to have, for those of us that appreciate 90s Superman comics. I almost got into Superman the same time you did, like chronologically the same year, because I got into Superman with the Reign of the Superman and kept going for a little after it. And unfortunately, it's the long hair killed my enthusiasm for it. But I've since gone back and I really like 90s. And yeah, seeing who I would like to see that universe's version of Conduit. I would like to see some kind of like jacked up 1940s, maybe 1950s, like engine punk version of Conduit. That would be really neat. And just the fact that his mom's like a crazy religious nut was really funny too. It doesn't even factor in his overbearing dad.
Right. Yeah. Well, speaking of the 90s comics, that's what's coming up on the show. Not too long from now, we're going to have a big sequel to our Crisis Till Death event from last year. So I'm very excited to reread those Kenny Braverman Conduit stories for the first time in decades now. So I'm looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it.
Thanks. Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. Well, I think that's sort of, we sort of hit on everything that, that I wanted to. Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, that is all the thoughts I can think to think.
Right on. Well, again, for anyone who hasn't read Superman Smashes the Klan or hasn't listened to the Clan of the Fiery Cross radio story from the Adventures of Superman radio show, we didn't mention Bud Collyer as the voice of Clark and Superman, but an iconic vocal performance, and does a great job of differentiating the characters. I mean, I think really set the template, and he continued to voice the character in other iterations, and even those after him, I think take some cues. So, but if anyone hasn't read or listened, hopefully we've made the case for it over the course of.
I hope so. This is a fun series all the way through. There are some weird story arcs that I haven't gotten to yet that I cannot wait to get to. Some of them are just your typical bank robbers and smugglers and stuff like that, but some of them sound bonkers, and I can't wait to listen to those.
Right on. Well, I hope you enjoy your continued exploration. I look forward to diving in more fully at some point as well. And yeah, I really appreciate these stories. Like I said, I unfairly discounted Smashes the Klan because it was for young adults. And like I said, radio show largely remains unexplored for me. And so this was really quite the revelation to see the, the depth, and the ambition of these stories in terms of the points that they were making and the way that they did it. So, yeah, I was tremendously impressed. I really enjoyed comparing notes with you. I hope that everyone will check out the Truth, Justice, and Hope podcast and check you out on Twitter. What's the handle for everyone to follow?
It's @AboutSuperman.
And you do such a great job with the Twitter. I mean, as you're going, I know, the podcast, I know you're largely focusing on the rebirth era and what you talk about, but and on Twitter, I know you'll write, blurbs and share some art about, issues as you're reading them. So the Twitter in and of itself is its own entity. Thing. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And that's why I got into podcasting, because I can't not read something I like and share my thoughts about it. So, it's, follow me on Twitter if you'd like my thoughts about everything. Listen to the podcast if you just want to hear me ramble about rebirth and my thoughts on ethical humanism. So,
right on. Well, thank you very much, Grant. And thank you to the audience. As always, I really appreciate you listening. Now, next week was going to be a skip week for Labor Day, but instead we're going to have something very special that is going to tee up a new side project that I'm going to do. So make sure that you come back next week and tune in to an all-new episode of Digging for Kryptonite. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Join the conversation by becoming part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group, like the Digging for Kryptonite Facebook page, and follow us on Instagram @DiggingForKryptonitePod and on Twitter @DiggingForKRPod. Also, be sure to visit FlatSquirrelProductions.com for more film and podcast projects, including My Comic Shop History and My Comic Shop Country. Thank you.